Okay, so today we're going to talk about democracy and politics. Um, well, a lot of the kind of things here might be familiar with most of you. It's just that I'm not so sure how in depth you have thought about these kind of things and the specific nuances about different issues within politics and democracy and what kind of debates that might arise from it. Okay, so the obvious thing here, we're going to start with what exactly is politics, because I think there needs to be a discussion on how do we imagine politics and what we think about it, and that would help us understand democracy in general and where it leads to, and how it helps people within it. Because I think a lot of people have this weird misconception that electoral democracy is very different from politics, or if it is not related to electoral democracy, all of a sudden it's not politics. The reality is that politics is way more encompassing and affects a lot of our lives, because at the end of the day, politics is just all the activities surrounding decision making. So if there is a situation where you need to make a certain decision that affects the lives of other people, or if there is a certain policy that affects you, then that is also considered to be politics. So when someone says that, oh, I don't want to be political, it's kind of weird, because however they want to chime into a certain discussion will always be political. The media that we consume, the movies that we watch, where we spend our money, all of that affects a lot of decision making in this world. It could affect decision making in terms of what kind of issues get discussed that eventually become part of party politics, or in the sense that it affects how we perceive each other culturally. So when somebody says that, oh, you should not make a political analysis of a movie, that kind of defeats the purpose, because how we consume information, which is through the movie, is very dependent on the lenses that we have, or what kind of society that creates these kind of movies that eventually we appreciate that, or what is considered to be quote unquote good when it comes to the movies itself. So when we talk about politics, it's not restricted to the ballot box. It's not restricted to political parties in itself. So this includes all the interactions that are involved, the discussions that people have, the networking that people have between different kinds of participants, how we express our certain ideas, our interests, all of that is political at the end of the day. And whenever there is some form of decision making, wherever it may be, at the workplace or in the office, between your club members and so on, um, those are all different levels of politics in the end. However, when it comes to this set of slides, even though I did say that there are a lot of cultural things, media stuff, our personal interests, and what um, kind of people do we associate ourselves with, all affect politics. The focus for today, a huge chunk of it, will be about governments and governing bodies in the end. Okay, so now that we have acknowledged that all of that is politics, how all the interactions surrounding decision making is politics, I think we also need to understand how we eventually make decisions, what influence our decisions in the end. So this is very dependent on the interests of what people have. And then there needs to also be a mechanism to gather all the information that is related to all of our interests and how we convey that itself. Of course, there are some places that are more accessible than others. In places that are way more accessible, it is easy for interest groups to put out specific policy demands. Or when you have like a democratized platform like social media, you can always create a hashtag to make sure that everyone could tweet under that. So there is a critical mass for people to understand a specific issue, and more people care about it in the end. So you also have that interplay between people who observe what the general public wants and the people who would eventually be part of political parties or the ballot box. That eventually leads to them voicing out these kind of issues in the end, or um, indirectly organizations surrounding political issues would become a place where people could, convey this kind of information, and then eventually that translates into the ballot box instead. But within that process, it's not just about how the information is gathered. And if you were to remember our class about media, the media at the end of the day is supposed to be information that people use to make decisions. And that is part and parcel of how we decide what becomes important or what we agree to be important information. However, it does not just stop in media. It's also about how people carry themselves within the media, or how people talk about these kind of things, what kind of language they use in the end. All of that influence how we make decisions. And I think a good example of this is that when we are talking about redistribution or social justice, which is a really hot button issue in politics, you know, in the 2020s and so on. When you are talking about this kind of issues, so there's a lot of like sensitive material because you're going to assign blame to different groups of people, or how you might demand someone to acknowledge their privilege along those lines. All of that information that, where you attack people, etc., is still dependent on the person receiving that information. Yeah. So you may become someone who's marginalized, but the person who has the privilege within that hierarchy or that society may or may not accept your narratives. So you have to figure out ways to make sure that they accept those narratives. For example, a lot of people argue that we need to play around with respectability politics. So respectability politics is when you have to portray yourself as someone who is respectable instead, someone that is um, arguing from a very rational perspective, that you are not forcing through your ideas that uh, floods the argument with all sorts of guilt tripping language along the slides. And you are not using that angry attitude against the other person. So some people argue that if you don't argue in a much more palatable manner, people won't have respect for you in the end. And that would eventually hurt that decision-making process because they wouldn't accept the information. So you may have access to media all you want, and people can process the information within that media. But if they don't consume that or they don't buy into it, that is also partially your fault. But you also have to ask yourself, do you want people to consume information that you are portraying based on how much they respect you? So some people argue that, well, that is not within my interest. We have the right to be angry because we experience kind of things. If they are not convinced by it, then they're probably wrong within this process. So sometimes it's not just about the final result of the decision-making process. It is also about how did it come about. Are we just going to get people to come to the conclusions that we want just because we portray ourselves as the most respectable person in the room? No, we might want to tell people that you should care for us because we should be cared for because we are human beings. And it all depends on the stakeholder at that moment. So all of that influence how we make decisions, or how other people not within our social group or not within the same marginalized groups as us make decisions. Yeah. Now, the discussion in general public when it comes to information and when it comes to decision making, this is often called discourse, a word that I actually really hate, even though all of us participate in it, because a lot of people misuse the word discourse and they treat that as an argument itself. But what about the discourse and so on? Whatever. I still think it's good for us to understand that, but just don't use it as a crutch because I don't see any eventual impact for it. I think discourse should be used as a mechanization of an argument rather than an argument in itself. Okay, so anyone can participate in discourse, but we have to admit there are some people who would influence the discourse more than the other. Maybe someone has a higher degree of familiarity um, with the topic. Maybe someone could articulate things better because of the culture that they were brought up in or the environment that they were in. Some people may have greater resources, more time, or they have more stakes in the issue that they're willing to make certain trade-offs and say some things should we deprioritize instead. So we're talking about groups like the media in general that's able to influence discourse. We're talking about lobby groups, political parties, of course. Political parties often have a huge interest in participating or at the very least listening to the discourse or reading whatever that's going through on Twitter and learning how to cut through the noise in that sense. Then also at the same time, you have the interests of industry, capital, and labor. They would have their own AGMs and announce things. Okay, so now that we've sort of like explained or went through what exactly is discourse, let's try to talk about who exactly participates within politics in general. Well, prior to this, when I said politics, I did say that politics encompasses more than just electoral democracy, but then we eventually have to zero into electoral democracy because that's where the next layer of politics actually comes in. And in this case, it's quite important because then you get to vote who eventually makes the decision or votes on certain bills and so on. And who gets to partake within this? If it's just on a part of discourse, it's practically everyone. But when it comes to electoral and representative democracy, it is very dependent, of course, on how democratized within that society in itself. In a much more authoritarian society, there is still some level of politics, but it's just that meaningful politics where decision making actually translate into real world impacts. There is a limited participation, and those positions are gate kept in that sense. So a society that is way more democratic would try their best to include anyone who is, of course, in their sound mind. They could express their interest and so on. However, in the past, you have a lot of restrictions. To be honest, a lot of them, I personally don't agree with, but I could understand some things like, oh, never mind, I disagree with all of it. Sorry about that. Like in the past, you have things like land ownership, gender and sexuality, poll taxes, where there used to be a time where for them to kick out poor people or unfortunately African Americans, they introduce poll taxes to make sure that people aren't able to participate because they have to pay money for it. And if you're a poor person, you feel discouraged from actually being part of the process instead. And there are literacy tests, which is kind of messed up considering the fact that quite a number of former slaves were never taught how to read. So they definitely get excluded, or there are a lot of people who might feel intimidated by this kind of things, so on. Personally, I think there are some requirements or restrictions that are defendable, even if I don't agree with it. For example, a media literacy test or political literacy test, that would probably be more defendable because you are asking people to have a certain standard or know a bit of things before they are able to actually make decisions for the country instead. We already expect things like people to be of sound mind, and also we expect them to be the age of majority because we know that is when people are able to make rational decisions and they are a fully formed human being by that has gone through the basics of early education, secondary education, so you know how to balance things or weigh different ideas instead. Not perfect, but good enough for you to make a moral decision at that point. And if you agree with that, um, why should you disagree with things like media literacy or political literacy? Again, I'm not saying that I 100% believe in it, and I don't think that it should be applied in the strictest manner, but I could empathize why some people might view this as a logical requirement for things instead. Okay. So throughout the years, of course, access to decision making in society that has improved when it comes to the suffrage movement, where women finally have the ability to vote and then have the ability to change the laws that affect them. The same thing also applies to Civil Rights Act. Though this is not something that is static, like just because that there are more people who are allowed to participate in politics in comparison to before, it does not mean that the fight to include more people within the decision making process has ended. So there are a lot of other things that people might consider, considering how much things impact that. For example, non-citizens living in foreign cities. So if you are an immigrant and you pay taxes in a different city, you live there, and the policies of that country will heavily affect you or that specific city, maybe you should have a say on um, the bylaws of the city or whatsoever, or whatever city council would like to do, and so on. This is actually a debate motion in world schools. I forgot which round, um, but I remember watching it, but it was quite some time ago. And then you also have people who have been disenfranchised because of criminalization. There are quite a number of places in this world where prisoners are not allowed to vote because you punish them by taking them away from society. And within that period, um, you are not supposed to influence politics or along those lines. And also, there are fears that prisoners might be captive audience, or you might promise a lot of ridiculous things like pardoning everyone within this prison, regardless of their background, etc., and they would just vote for you and so on. Though that's a much more extreme situation, and I don't think that's a favorable characterization. Personally, I think prisoners should have the ability to vote because they still go out into society. And I do think that is a useful tool for rehabilitation. But also at the same time, there are a lot of people who were former convicts, they left prison, but they still don't have the ability to vote. But there are places like in the United States that thinks that they need to be continuously punished, which to me I think is unfair because they have been rehabilitated, they've done their time, they understood what they did wrong, but now they're trying to be someone new instead in itself. So this shows that there is a group of people who are still disenfranchised, and you could still work towards including them within the process instead. In non-democratic societies, you eventually have to find alternative ways to participate. Remember, the gatekeeping happens in a much more authoritarian society, that the people who make decisions eventually aren't able to aren't willing to take into account other people who might also be capable, or there is a bottleneck of who should actually be allowed to be part of it. So if you want to get their attention and write laws surrounding you, you probably need to increase your value, or you need to call attention to yourself to make sure that the rest of the world is paying attention and they want to gain some kind of legitimacy. They have to figure out ways to include your perspective within the policies instead. But to understand, all of this about, participating in politics and so on, we eventually need to understand what is a democracy in the first place. Of course, I'm not going to talk about the history of it when it comes to ancient Greece and so on, but at the very least, we'll talk about, the background of things, whatever it is. So yeah, what is a democracy and how is it conducted? Okay, so a democracy is a form of government in which people in general hold the power and they could influence the decision-making process that I mentioned earlier. So it could be in the form of a direct democracy, it could be in the form of representative democracy, but again, it differs from state to state on how it is implemented, and there's a huge range of what it means to be democratic. So I'm going to show a chart a bit. So let's take a look at all the different countries that are considered to be democratic or not. As you can see, the United States is a flawed democracy in that sense. Canada, you could consider them to be a full democracy. But this chart compiled by The Economist. I think it's kind of interesting when they label countries full democracies, flawed democracies. Because take a look at a country like Japan, which is considered to be a full democracy, I guess, unless my eyes deceive me when it comes to colors. But they have been a one-party um, state for a huge majority of its modern existence post World War II, with the exception of, I think, in 2008, where they had an opposition for one term, but then it got reversed quickly because it was kind of tough for them to hold on to power. Um, and a huge chunk of it, it's still the same party. It's the LDP, Liberal Democratic Party, in Japan, that holds on to power for such a long time. And then in Japan, for you to become a politician or for you to become a candidate and be on a ballot in the first place, it's quite expensive. It has one of the highest cost for deposit to be part of it. It's like, I forgot how much it is, but I remember it's like in the tens of thousands of dollars, which is kind of ridiculous. So it basically means you need a party to actually make anything meaningful, or you need to have the resources. You need to be part of larger organizations, so you might have to fall in line. So it does not make it easy for people to create alternative political parties itself. Now, the reason why I brought up this issue about it being a single party state for a huge chunk of its history is because you have to ask yourself what it means to be a democracy. Is it just the ability to vote? Because if you are talking about just the ability to vote, there are places that has a overarching single political party that controls a lot of the politics whatsoever and still has a voting mechanism, but it looks very different from other democracies that are considered to be flawed or full democracies. Let's take, for example, Cuba. In Cuba, you have the ability to vote in certain representatives, but they have to be approved by the Cuban Communist Party. The same case in China, where you can actually vote in people into the legislative yuan, but it is considered to be a authoritarian regime in that sense. But the Chinese government says that it is a democracy within the context of Chinese politics instead. It is a democracy that is very different from the West, and they're doing that because of the nature of that vanguard party that defends communist ideals from the outside for fear of infiltration and things like that and so on. Then at the same time, you have non-communist nations like Japan that has a lot of control from that single party state. Sorry, single party that's controlled a huge chunk of their politics. The same thing that you could argue about Singapore, but Singapore is a relatively happier place in comparison to a lot of other authoritarian regimes or hybrid regimes in that sense. Okay, but anyway, when it comes to democratic states, the more democratic it is, the more accessible things are. It's normally perceived to be quote unquote freer because you get to say whatever you need to influence the decision-making process. But a lot of people also argue that this normally means that the interests of capital and industry also now has an outright influence over the decision-making process by flooding things within the media, controlling the narrative for things, picking and choosing who gets to speak on their platforms and promote them at the end of the day. So it depends on those kind of characterizations and how eventually you want to defend democracy in itself. But again, if you are defending those democracies and you say that they're freer, you can say that, well, the media gets to do that, but you also have interest groups that are also more than happy to push for what they have in that itself. But a lot of countries use the democratic process also to establish legitimacy over people. So if people are able to participate in politics and they have indirect control over the policies of a specific state, then you can say that, oh, we are not just ruling over the people, it's the people who gave us the mandate in order for us to carry out certain things. So I have some form of legitimacy. I am the true representative of this government. Other people have to back down and realize um, that they do not have the interest of most people, no matter how flawed the voting system is for them. Um, so that is such a really good tool to gain legitimacy because there is an immediate metric. So much so that countries like China and Cuba still have that process, even though it is not to the full extent where you have multi-party democracy, but their democracy is within the context of that single party and those who follow the overarching constitution of these political parties instead. So yeah, um, like I said, for example, in the legislative you want, but the ballots that you have, the people on them are also pre-selected, which is one of the reasons why places like Hong Kong were not happy when Beijing has a bigger influence on who gets to be on the ballot, because they see that as an extension of what China has been doing. And Hong Kongers have always had the expectation after 1997, during the British to China handover of Hong Kong, that they would eventually have the ability to vote. And in 1997, they set a timeline of 50 years for that handover. So at that point, from that perspective, 50 years is such a really long time. A lot of the people who were involved in the decision-making process for the handover probably wouldn't be here for 2047. So in their heads, they were thinking that, oh, the world is liberalizing, the world is becoming more democratic. There is a possibility that China might also become democratic in that process. So there is a lot of question marks leading up to 2047. Um, of course, at the same time, you had people like Francis Fukuyama who argued like this is the end of history, or the richer a nation gets, the more democratic they become, because people who are richer becomes more educated. They think that they would have a bigger say within the government and they push the government act a certain way, and the government eventually have to follow. But it turns out it did not work in that direction. I guess he should have looked at Saudi Arabia in the first place. Um, and sometimes it's a bit more effective, even if it is performative. For example, the Cuban Family Code in 2022. So this is where Cuba legalized same-sex marriages, and they also expanded the definition of families. So the interesting thing about the Cuban Family Code and why it is also considered to be a legalization of same-sex marriages, it is because they allow anyone who is living together to register as a family. So they could adopt and so on. So you could have a group of men, 10 men, registering as a family. So I thought that was kind of interesting because they have a much more fluid concept of a family instead. But the point is that even non-democratic regimes want to use elements of this of democracy to give themselves some kind of legitimacy in the eyes of the world. Okay, but considering that, I think we need to get into the principles of what makes a democracy in popular imagination. I think all of these specific principles can become its own argument that could translate into different layers and so on. So the 5 principles that I'm going to explore today are free and fair elections, though I think that is intuitive and straightforward, civic participation, rule of law, transparency, and accountability. Now, despite the fact that I wrote 5 principles here, I don't think this is an exhaustive list. There are many other lists out there of what makes a democracy, but these are stuff that I grouped together. Sometimes you have other requirements, but I think those requirements sort of act as like subcategories or sub-principles to these ideas here. Right, let's talk about free and fair elections. What do I mean by this? So what I mean by this is that these are countries where you have universal suffrage. So what I mean here is that anyone who meets the requirements of that country, they should be able to vote. They should be able to participate within the process, and they have the ability to make decisions independently. What I mean here is that um, no one can intimidate them when it comes to elections. So that's the fair part in free and fair elections. So things are done in secret. People can choose to not vote sometimes, though there are places like Australia that demand mandatory voting. Personally, I think mandatory voting should be a thing. Even though some people think that not voting or spoiling your vote is considered to be a legitimate option and so on. But anyway, free and fair elections is like it's also a mindset. It's also an environment where people are able to make decisions without intimidation, and if possible, not influenced by any form of direct monetary incentives. Um, Sometimes it's not just about the money. Sometimes it's about them guilt tripping people and say that, well, you are losing out. Everyone is taking the money. Your life is going to be horrible. Um, you may as well vote for us instead, and we'll give you XYZ in comparison. So it is some kind of intimidation, but it's sort of like a roundabout way of intimidation in that sense. And then you need to have independent election authorities. You don't want people who are obviously party people to be part of your respective election commission. You don't want them to be explicit about their political views. You want them to keep quiet, and you want to make sure that these people would carry out their work regardless of their political affiliation or what they personally believe instead. And I think this is why you eventually have independent observers, and you have an international community that is able to see the transparency of this, not see how these people carry out their work, and they could go on television and make fun of the election commissions for not doing well. Like I remember when um, the first time Pakatan Harapan won, immediately people were uh, making jokes about the elections commission. There's one guy who said that Sarawak is bigger than West Malaysia. So why are there places in West Malaysia aren't able to get their ballot count right at that moment? And it was 3 in the morning. And it was one of those few times where I feel as if that, oh, finally we do have some kind of freedom of information or freedom of speech in that sense, whatever it is. But the point is that on top of this, it's also about access to information. So if your information is obviously biased, like almost all of your media is controlled by certain political entities or controlled by people who have obvious interests um, in the political scene, then probably you don't have free and fair elections because you don't have access to right information and so on. If you don't have any alternative media, it's also tough. And this is why people argue that Malaysia didn't really become a uh, country with free and fair elections until after alternative media happened, because alternative media is like for the first time people are able to get a huge range of views eventually that could influence the discourse for uh, their elections. So, okay, the next thing I want to talk about is civic participation. So you can't just have free and fair elections and then not have um, civic participation. So it's not enough that people vote. People need to have the ability to imagine that they can be on a ballot, that there are other activities surrounding voting that provides them a way to be part of it. You provide them the environment to care about different kinds of issues if the ballot box is not enough, or you create that critical mass so that people are able to run a referendum. But you need the ability to imagine first. And for people to imagine that, you need other people to participate in the first place. So it is like a process, layers of it. So it starts with people participating. It might be tough, but eventually they get their friends to come along. And that eventually translates to more NGOs or more different groups or more events surrounding specific social causes that helps people imagine to um, imagine a pathway for them or create an environment for them to be interested in this kind of issues. And they read up about a lot of things and they talk to their friends about it. So this looks like um, NGOs running things like election simulations or whatsoever, or going out for advocacy for specific causes, like what Greenpeace does, annoyingly approaches you at the mall asking you to sign these things and that whatsoever. But whatever, that's part of civic participation. Or things like debating, where you could actually talk about things like this, and then you could imagine yourself in a situation where you have to make decision making, and that translates into your politics and get you interested in reading more and talking to more people around it. So it also looks like community organization, organized protests, and so on, rallies, whatsoever. Now, you might be asking, what does all of this have to do with democracy? It is because if people don't care about things and you don't create the environment, then they don't go to vote. So who controls decision making in that? It's often the rich who always have an interest in making sure that they get their way. And all they have to do is to pay politicians who are involved in this and that, whatever political party, because the rest of us are not interested. So the best way for you to make you feel as if that you are interested in this and that is to create an environment, whatever it may be. You could go out and talk to other people about different things in politics that would translate to something. And this is why I really hate it when people say that social media or social media activism isn't politics. It is politics. It is a form of civic participation because things like hashtags or whatsoever do get eventually people talk about it. And I think it is unfair for people to say that they just talk about it, they don't really do anything, because you need to create a critical mass for something. Not everyone can become organizers or actual protesters, whatsoever. But what everyone can become is to create the perception that there is a critical mass. So it creates some form of motivation for people who really believe in something. So they participate, they would eventually, go out and do stuff. They continue to be part of electoral politics. They know that there is some kind of support, even if your political party is so small. But if you have like 1,000 people on social media saying, go PSM or whatever, and they believe in that, and then they would still stay motivated to participate and become part of politics and not allow politics to be dominated by a small group of people. That motivation alone is powerful in itself. And people get scared knowing that, oh, you are arguing against a huge group of people. I need to sort of like temper my language in the process itself. So that's civic participation, where people can imagine that there is a pathway for them to go to instead. It's not just literal participation, it's the ability to imagine a way you can participate that then translates into ballot boxes. Okay, the third principle that I think that is useful when it comes to democracy is the rule of law. So the rule of law, as opposed to rule by law, means that the law applies equally to everyone. So the reason why is this important is that, like I said before, for politics to operate, you need discourse. You need everyone to participate within the discussion, and you don't want the discussion to be hampered, not just because the state is actively taking people away and the state is massaging the narrative. It is also because some people might self-censor in a lot of things that you don't have an accurate view of what do people feel on the ground. That it was really hard for people to speak up whatever they believe in because they think that they're going to be punished and be treated differently. Like freedom of speech for one person, but freedom of speech for not the other person, and so on. So it creates an element of fear. But a rule of law guarantees that all of us can participate within a democracy. So we don't feel intimidated, we don't feel discouraged, and so on. Oh yeah, by the way, rule of law versus rule by law, I forgot to explain the difference. Rule of law is when the law applies equally to everyone, but rule by law is when the people who rule a country rule them using laws. where they enact laws to rule over people. And this distinction is important because the rule of law means that the law is the most important thing, and everyone follows that standard. We read through that, we write the laws through the people we elect in the first place. Whereas rule by law, it is the rulers that write these laws, they execute it, they interpret it, they are judge, jury, executioner in that sense. So we don't want that because it makes it hard for people to speak up. And sometimes the people above benefit from our dissatisfaction so that they have like a better understanding of what reality is rather than hiding in their palaces thinking that everything is fine and dandy and then realize the next election everyone's voting against them. Okay, so what are things that are necessary for rule of law? An independent judiciary. You don't want the judiciary to sort of like take orders from the top. Let's say you get into a, let's say, for example, there's 1,001 defamation cases to try to keep you bankrupt so that you aren't able to participate in politics, which is what Lee Kuan Yew tried to do. And that's why it's so hard to get opposition in Singapore. But the point is that it would have been worse if you don't have an independent judiciary when they take orders from the top, because they can change the result or tweak things enough to make sure that certain political opponents get bankrupt. Certain political opponents end up in jail. Certain political opponents will be humiliated throughout a trial. And they are drowned by a lot of things like media interviews, the kangaroo court, and people actively trying to paint them in a negative picture that they went through jail. Like having a picture of a political opponent in trial is already quite powerful in that sense. So you don't want that additional layer of influence in itself. Then, of course, you need due process. You can't just catch someone and not give any reason. You need to provide the reasons to do so. You need to give them the right to trial or whatever. Whatever we learned last week about procedural justice, that is part and parcel of rule of law to make sure that democracy eventually works. Okay, the next thing is transparency. Now, transparency is when you are able to see how the decision-making process happens. So you need people to sort of like have a rough idea on where these ideas are at whatever stage it is. So it may start off as discourse that will eventually turn into critical mass to the media, whatever, and then certain political parties gain an interest in that, and then that eventually translates into people getting elected, goes to the it goes into a ballot initiative, goes into the ballot box, or people get voted into the legislature, and then that eventually translates into them writing up policies. But the whole point here is that you get to see the whole process so that you are convinced that the end result is through that level of due process or that level of procedure. So that the end result is a reflection of what people see on the ground. And if it is not, we can criticize every angle of it to improve the process in the future. If you're not happy with the huge amount of influence by lobby groups in the legislature, you can eventually criticize it because it's transparent. You know who gets to talk to who, which cliques of people hang out with each other in Congress and so on. You need people who are willing to explain things within the media so that it aligns with what has been promised. Or when you have hearings, so rather than saying that we're going to ban TikTok straight away, as much as I think it's ridiculous if they want to ban TikTok, at the very least, I get to see the weird questions that comes up when they are questioning. So I forgot his name. That Singaporean guy who became the CEO of TikTok. I forgot his name. And Dan Crenshaw with his eye patch, asking him all sorts of weird questions. And you have old boomer politicians who our stuff our stuff like, does TikTok need to connect to your house Wi-Fi or house internet? So it's weird. But the whole point is that that also allows us to choose to vote them in or vote them out. In the case of Malaysian politics, it's the same also. We get to see all the arguments in parliament, but also, of course, it runs the risk of turning the parliament into a performative stage. So people are just performing for 30-second clips that could be edited into TikTok, which is what PN is really good about. Like, you may have really nuanced discussions, but they'll just take that one part and then that eventually translates into greater TikTok views, and they use that for propaganda, whatsoever. But anyway, that still shows that it's something good because it creates a transparent atmosphere, and it allows us to also do the same if we need to. So it's not technically Prakata National's fault. It is Pakatan Harapan's fault for not using the same platform of transparency. Like, all of this is recorded and live streamed. They could have also used that too itself. But anyway, that eventually translates into better decision-making process for us in the future that goes through the media cycle too. And next thing, accountability. I think I've spoken about this before in our class on governance. So when it comes to accountability, it's simple. It's making sure that there is some form of check and balance. So I don't think it's good enough, or most people who believe in this don't think it's good enough to just say transparency, that you can see the process. You eventually need people who have power to sort of like execute that form of accountability. So if someone messes up in parliament, right, it's not good enough that we see that they mess up. But if they commit crimes and you need someone to actually have power over them, you need the separation of powers to act as check and balance to push things back, and so on. So, for example, if someone writes a law that is unconstitutional, the judiciary can easily say, "Wait a minute, no, go back. It's unconstitutional. That doesn't follow what the people eventually want. They have voted for you to follow certain things. You must rewrite this instead." So they push back certain things, and they are able to get rid of certain laws that are unconstitutional in comparison. So you stop people from absorbing too much power. You are able to force politicians to carry out laws based on what they think a huge majority of people believe in, not just them. Of course, that is in theory. Okay, how it applies is a whole different question. Etc. Okay, I think there are degrees to it. Okay, so let's talk about who gets elected, or how do we vote these people in, and so on. Who exactly goes through the whole process? Not all countries have the same system, so I'm going to divide this discussion into two different parts: presidential system and also the Westminster system a bit later. But when it comes to the American presidential system, of course, obviously, they get to vote for the executive, which is where you get the president, but also you get the governor of the state. You also have people being voted into the legislative, Congress, Senate, the state legislatures, and so on. And the cool thing about American politics is that they are so committed to the idea that every process needs to be democratized, up to the point that their political parties have very, very public primary elections for their presidential candidates. So in other places, you do have candidates for the president of the party, right? And so on. But the cool thing about American politics, as much as how I think it might, go off the rails, is that you can have like 1,001 people running as presidential candidates, and everyone has to take them seriously in that sense, within the range of whatever the major political parties are, and so. So you have people who could challenge certain candidates who might have been popular within the political party, but turns out people don't like them as candidates. So a good example of this would be how Trump destroyed the Republican Party. He destroyed all other candidates who people thought would have been the Republican candidate because of their demeanor or whatever it is, or because their ties to the political party and so on. So the voter base can vote out these people themselves. And to a lesser extent, you could argue this was the threat that Bernie Sanders gave to the Democrat Party. As much as the Democrat Party sort of like gave Bernie Sanders a hard time and things, and he didn't eventually gain anything meaningful out of it. His competition, or see, him creating that competition, actually forced people to discuss things in different directions. And the cool part is that sometimes you have candidates who might not care about certain things, but because there is competition and they realize that the competition has been defending that, and turns out they really that is a really hot button issue and it's a reflection of what people want, candidates would eventually switch their position. So, for example, Bernie Sanders really spoke a lot about student loans, healthcare, and so on. And then that eventually forced Joe Biden to eventually talk about student loan debt forgiveness, which is very far from what his politics were in the past. Or people like Obama didn't even support gay marriage at first, or he wasn't like vocal about it at first. I don't know about him personally, but he did not support gay marriage to how he eventually did, and so on. So you have other people talking about these issues and push them to a certain direction. The opposite is also true when it comes to the Republican Party. So everyone realized that Trump talking about the culture wars, forgetting about proper political decorum, not willing to talk about respectability and so on, that eventually changed the tune of people like Ted Cruz, or in this case, you have people like Ron DeSantis trying to also win the culture war side of the issue instead. So Ron DeSantis changed his views, or not change, doubled down on his views on the culture war, and he's attacking Disney for their quote unquote wokeness or whatever. And it all started from Trump's demeanor and so on, because they only have one spot within that political party. And if you want to run as an independent, you have to go elsewhere instead. And you need a lot of resources for that. Okay, but on top of that, I also want to point out that while in theory, Americans do vote for the president, who they technically vote for, they're voting for their electoral college selectors in that sense. So every state has a number of votes, and then your vote is according to the proportion of actual valid votes in the country in itself. So unfortunately, this creates this weird situation where places like California becomes less important on who becomes president in comparison to a place like Wyoming. So this is why when it comes to primary elections, you would realize that there are certain states that presidents would visit first in order to get the ball running. Like so many people would start in Iowa, they will go to places like Wyoming eventually. But the point is that there is such a strong rural weightage in that sense. So if you live in a rural area, you have a greater say on who becomes president, because each electoral college vote has lesser of a threshold. I'm going to show a map for this in a bit. Okay, but another thing about the American presidential system, before I get to the map, I want to point out is that they have a very strict separation of powers. For example, um, Joe Biden is not a senator. He is not part of Congress or the House of Senate whatsoever. In order for you to be president, you need to resign from your positions. Like Barack Obama was a senator for one term, but then he became president. And that eventually led to um, him picking his own cabinet, but his cabinet cannot come from the legislature, which is very different from what Westminster countries actually do instead. They cannot be part of the executive. So let's take a look at the map here. So California on paper technically has like pretty huge, 55. When you think back about it, the population of California is larger in comparison to so many other states. So you have places like Wyoming, even though it's 3, the population of Wyoming is like what? 250,000? I forgot. I've actually met a Republican from Wyoming before. He understands that they have an upper hand when it comes to American politics itself. So this is why people argue that it's kind of unfair to look at America as a map, as a map like this, because it gives the illusion that there are more Republicans in the world. But the reality is that there are more people who live in these blue states. There are more people who live here and voted for Hillary Clinton, let's say, or voted for Biden. So if you want to just calculate based on the number of votes directly, the Democrats actually had an upper hand in comparison. And the Republicans have a harder time convincing more people. And you have to remember, land does not vote. People vote. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Let's talk about the parliamentary system instead. So in the Westminster parliamentary system, citizens could vote candidates into the legislature, and then they become members of parliament. And the member of parliament with the most amount of support gets to become the prime minister. And so this is why in countries like Malaysia or the UK, people could actually run a vote of no confidence and kick out the prime minister. It's because the prime minister position is not voted by citizens. It is voted by member of parliaments, and their job is not a separate job that has a mandate. It is a job that is intertwined with whatever they're doing within the legislature. It is a job that requires them to become an MP first and then become a prime minister. And so you vote for the prime minister indirectly, and they put their vote for that person and so on. But of course, it creates a lot of the problems like instability through the vote of no confidence, and then you run the risk of people switching sides or whatever it is, like what happened before we had the anti-hopping law in Malaysia, and then you also have what was it again? The risk of people winning easy constituencies, and that leads them to become prime minister. A good example for this is that Langkawi used to be a really strong seat for Dr. Mahathir, but Dr. Mahathir will never contest in Subang. He would lose badly to Wong Chang there because that is not a strong base. But him being in Langkawi guarantees his position as the prime minister, even though there are less people who voted for that. So this is why when you have a change of government due to parties switching around, people are not happy because they didn't vote a specific person or political party thinking someone will become the prime minister. This is why I think it was unfair. A lot of people made fun of that women protesting, asking, siapa Muhyiddin? Aku tak pernah pun undi Muhyiddin, and so on. It's because she literally never voted for Muhyiddin. None of us did. But Muhyiddin became prime minister. through this roundabout manner instead in itself. But the other thing about the Westminster system, like I said, you need to go become an MP in order for you to get into that prime minister executive position. But a Westminster system isn't strict about separation of powers. So um, we already have that, but the cabinet is also made up of people who are from the legislature. So it's a bit fluid in that sense. And the separation of power is more like an informal thing instead. And you have to remember that the separation of power is a very French and American idea in which the British sort of like eventually absorbed, but they did not like 100% apply it in that sense. But the point is that um, they have to come through as MP. Sometimes you can appoint technocrats to be part of it, but I don't think there are countries where they have a huge majority of technocrats instead. Okay, so let's talk about the different kinds of voting process here. And not all places use the same kind of voting process. So the first one I want to talk about is the first past the post system. This is what we use in Malaysia. To be honest, I think this is a colonial construct. I'll get into it later. We should abandon first past the post, to be honest. I disagree with first past the post for many different reasons. We'll talk about that later. But it's basically a winner takes all system. It's called first past the post because the first person that passes the barrier with the amount of votes will become the winner in that situation. The second thing I want to talk about is proportional representation, which to me, while it's fairer, I do think there's a lot of instability that comes from it. And the third one is ranked choice voting. This is what I am more inclined towards because ranked choice voting, you don't just vote for one single candidate and that's it. You would have a livelier democracy because no one needs to suck up to the larger political parties and work under those systems. You have like a range of things instead. So if there are 10 political parties, you have 10 10 parties to rank on instead. And I'll show illustrations of it. So you rank all the candidates on the ballot. So it's almost like a, how do you say this? It's almost like a survey. Who do you prefer the most here? Rank 1 to 10. How many points you want to give these people? So your second choice still matters. And I'll demonstrate a bit later. But let's talk about first past the post first. Okay. So here's an example of how first past the post might work in an election with 3 candidates. So let's say that Akasha receives 40% of the vote. And then Gori, I think Gori is here, receives 35% of the vote. And Go Huizhen receives 25% of the vote. I hope you people know who is Go Huizhen, but okay. So if you were to look at the map, 60% of the people voted against Akasha. But Akasha still won the elections in this case. So the good thing about first past the post is that it's easy to understand. More votes immediately. But is that really representation? Does that actually reflect what people believe in? And is it fair to the decision-making process? So a person who is against first past the post might think that, wait a minute, this is pretty messed up. All of us hate this guy. All of us want to argue against him. But yet this person gets to do whatever. So the only people who gets representation are people who believe in that and so on. So it normally means that people have to work within the system and they have to be part of larger coalitions. And this is why PSM and Muda really wants to be part of PH. Not because they like PH, but because of first past the post. They have to be part of it. And this is another problem within American politics too. And this is why in American politics, you only have those 2 political parties because you don't want a splinter vote. So there are places in America that have like third-party candidates who would siphon off votes from other people. And if you are a large political party, all you have to do so is to do the bare minimum and make sure all these other people argue against each other. And this is one of the reasons why George Bush got into the White House at one point. It is because of Ralph Nader, who ran as a third-party candidate, that managed to siphon off at least that's what you call it, to siphon off votes from the Democratic candidate at that time, Al Gore, that they actually had to go to the Supreme Court to recount things because it was so close. In the end, but a lot of people were not happy with that Supreme Court case whatsoever. But the point is that you're siphoning off votes, but at the same time, it's still fair that people voted for them. Like it's probably fair for me to vote for Gori because even though Ashley or Go Raisin might have stood a larger chance and so on or whatever. I would have voted for Gori because it's probably closer to my political beliefs. I don't know. So there's so many Americans whose political beliefs are closer to Ralph Nader's, and that eventually led to votes going in that direction and so on. And this is why people were really scared of Bernie Sanders running as an independent because they fear that it might fracture the Democratic vote. But can you really blame people for not liking the the Democrats and whoever their candidate was and so on? So yeah, those are the downfalls of FPPP. One more downfall I want to talk about is that politics or how we think about politics will get stunted because you are ever forever going back to those main political parties that they don't need to improve or they don't want to entertain other fringe ideas that could have been explored, that could have gained critical mass. Instead, all the other smaller political parties would die out for not being part of the coalition instead. Okay, so let's talk about the next one. Proportional representation. So proportional representation counts all the votes, but they don't have constituencies. I mean, they do have constituencies, but as in like, they don't have specific constituency rep that eventually leads to them arguing from the perspective of that constituency, but more like it's based on the percentage of votes. So let's say that you have 100 seats in political parties. So let's say the Gurtat Singh fan base won 40% of the vote. Then they get 40 seats. You have 35% of the vote, you win 35 seats. Then you have the Shashita Kedahan Liberation Party, 25% of the vote, you get 25 seats in the process. So you have guaranteed seats if you have enough percentage. So it allows a wider range of ideals of what politics could be because you don't have to pander. You could use the purest form of what you have, and you don't have to compromise because you have that representation. So it guarantees what you have. And the cool thing is that if you have proportional representation, and I'm not happy with PH, I'm not happy with BN, I'm not happy with Prakatan, and I wanted to vote for a smaller party, let's say the Shashta Kedahan Liberation Party, or I wanted to vote for PSM instead. That would eventually lead to PSM getting representation. And it's good for political parties whose support is like scattered around the country. And I'm pretty sure PSM has like voters all across the country. And if you want to take a look at their social media presence, it shows that they're everywhere, but they can't vote for that because the vote needs to be tied in a first past the post system. It needs to be tied to a constituency. So, but of course, PR normally means that If you are a larger chunk of the society, then unfortunately you will always get representation, but people are declining representation with that. And it normally affects, and sorry, and this is normally applied for um, smaller countries in comparison. Okay, so the next one, and this is probably my favorite, what I prefer, to be honest, um, ranked choice voting. So let's say Cami ranks Gori as the first choice, right? Akasha as the second choice, and Go Wazin as the third choice. Um, Even if Gori doesn't get most of the votes, um, Cami's second choice, which is Akasha, still matters. And we'll go through all this. Kailash votes for Go Wazin as the first choice, Gori as the second, Akasha as the third. Kathleen ranks Akasha as the first, Go Wazin as the second, and Gori as the third choice. So let's see how it will play out considering all of this. So the way they do is that they have multiple counts of voting. And unfortunately, when it comes to the first vote, Gori receives the fewest number of votes, unfortunately. So you get eliminated from it. So Cami's vote then gets transferred to Akasha because Akasha is the second choice. And then Kailash's vote gets transferred to Gori, all based because of the second choice preference. Okay? So now Akasha has 2 votes, and then Gori has 1 vote. So now, since Akasha has a majority of the votes, Akasha is considered or declared as the winner instead. So it's fairer in the sense that my second choice still matters. My second choice, like for example, if I were to vote for, let's say in Malaysia, eventually I have the option to vote for, okay, this is just a hypothetical scenario, but let's say I have a choice to vote for PSM, Pakatan Harapan. I may not like Pakatan Harapan, but I still don't want Perikatan to win. I might not want Barisan Nasional to win. So I'll probably rank PSM first, Pakatan Harapan second, just in case PSM doesn't get enough votes. Pakatan Harapan would still get my vote in that case. So yeah, it's a ranking system in comparison. Tier list for that Zoomer speak. Tier list. Okay, so here are some pros and cons. To go through things quickly. First past the post, straightforward, easy to understand. Even your grandmother understands it. They have most number of votes, they win. The cons is that winners are not actually winners. So this is why there are a lot of horrible people who still can become politicians instead. Applies in the US, UK, Malaysia. Proportionate representation, you get a representation, you get a representation, everyone gets representation. But it's very fractured because no one wants to compromise because you have your purest form of representation instead. And then you have RCV in places like Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, and so on. This is where I think preference gets recorded the best because your second choice still matters. So, but anyway, it's quite complicated. People need to understand more math, more political parties to do so. It will take a harder time for people to vote. It got so complicated that the Australian government had to force everyone to go vote eventually. Because there are a lot of people who just say, oh, I have like 25 choices and I'm going to rank all 25 of them. Why should I sit for a test on a free day? I may as well go do something else. So the Australian government said that, nope, go back to the voting booth, you vote or else we will punish you instead. And that becomes a crime in that sense. Get fined throughout the process. All right. So some countries are a mix of certain systems. There are places in Canada that uses first past the post, but there are places in Canada, provinces that actually use RCV. I need to double check who. I think there are places in the United States have also converted to RCV, to be honest. But yeah, I have to check that too. Okay, which then leads to the third part of the lecture. What are the alternatives to representative democracy? I'll go through things quickly because I think we're running out of time. The alternatives are probably, you've heard of them, direct democracy. Places like Switzerland do have a form of direct democracy where people are able to vote things directly. You have sortition democracy, where there is it works literally like a lottery on who gets to become a candidate. It differs from one place to another. Some places they automatically become part of the city council. In some places they get on the ballot box and so on, but things got sorted out. And then you have technocracies, which could be hybrids rather than just purely autocratic technocracies instead. But I'll go through them one by one. Right, direct democracy, it's obvious. It's, well, a democracy that's direct, closer to what the Greeks imagined democracy should be. It's where citizens are directly involved in the voting process instead of delegating it to a political party or to a person instead. So this can be in the form of like voting in the legislature, not in the legislature, or in the form of referendums. And I think the second one is more familiar for most of us, even though I don't think in Malaysia referendums are that common. I actually have no idea what is the process to get things on a ballot initiative in Malaysia. Then you could also vote as the policy making body. It's normally done in smaller scale, smaller countries, but there are countries like Switzerland that does this on a nationwide scale. So in Switzerland, they have like a hybrid system in which you have a parliament, but citizens can also propose initiatives, and that becomes what people vote for directly. So if you have a bill, you can go into Switzerland. Sorry, you can go into their parliament, eventually propose it, and then people will vote for it. Everyone in the country will then have to vote for it if it's necessary or not. The next example of a direct democracy is referendums. So referendums happen when you have like a very specific issue that holds like huge cultural values or impacts people more than the average elections issue, or the interest is brought up by very specific groups. Sometimes the topic is too controversial, or sometimes it does not align with certain political views. I think a good example of how sometimes what people care for doesn't actually reflect political views is that in Florida, it is a very Republican state, and they voted heavily for Trump. But they had a referendum on a minimum wage, and people voted for a higher minimum wage. So it shows that sometimes political parties and political parties winning doesn't actually translate into what people eventually want. So referendums are like a purest expression of the will of the people at that, regardless of whether you like it or not. There are some examples of this, like for example, the 2016 Brexit referendum. You had I think 2014, I forgot when was the Scottish independence referendum, the 1997 Quebec independence referendum. You had the Catalonian independence referendum, which I don't think is recognized by the Spanish authorities. You had same-sex referendums in Taiwan, Ireland, Australia, and so on. So there is some level of direct democracy there. I don't know when was the last time Malaysia had a referendum. I don't know actually. I have no idea when. Yeah, so one of you should Google that. When was the last time we had a referendum? I don't think we've had any in our recent history. The closest would probably be the Cobalt Commission and their inquiry whatsoever. I don't think it was a real referendum. Yeah. And so on. Okay, so yeah, these are examples of referendums. Okay, so what is sortition? Literally random, drawn by lots, and it's normally applied to a smaller scale of things. So you have like really random people, like really funny situations where random people who you would not imagine to be in politics would be on a city council. One of my favorite examples is this black metal musician Fenris of Dark Throne, um, who eventually had to sit on a city council or on a local town council um, seat. So I think the way it works in Norway is that um, they don't have enough people who want to get into a life of politics, so they have a sortition, and then you vote based on that, whoever your candidates are. This guy didn't want to become a politician, but he was forced to do so. And then there are places like Iceland and Ireland. Oh my God, there's a mistake. Iceland and Ireland. They use this for constitutional amendments. Just pick random people. You might think this is weird, but it's actually no different from jury duty. So that is an alternative. Is that so? It's not like they just have sortition democracy. They also have other things like representative democracy, but this is on top of what they already have. Okay, then you have technocracy. That's when you have experts called in to rule over a legislative body. And one of the reasons why people argue the EU isn't democratic. So you have countries like China that are obviously authoritarian, of course, and they get technocrats to be part of whatever decision-making process. So they get experts to run things. But of course, if you have quote-unquote experts, they have a very narrow view of how things operate and so on. Sometimes you need non-experts to put in the moral position. It's like that Jeff Goldblum quote from Jurassic Park. You people spend so much time thinking on how to do it that you didn't consider to think whether you should not instead. So people who are outside of that technocracy might ask those philosophical questions on whether we should do it or not. So again, going back to the EU, there are parts of the EU that are not considered to be democratic, purely technocratic, like the European Central Bank or the European Commission. They're all technocratic bodies that there is no voting within it. And so I think, is it the ECB or the European Commission, that they're made up of finance ministers? So it's kind of weird in the sense that it's like you have to get voted into a constituency and then get picked as a finance minister, and then eventually you get onto the ECB. And so yeah, it's not democratic. It's technocratic instead. I think there are pros and cons to this, but we'll talk about it some other time. All right. So in Malaysia, or countries like Malaysia, we have layers to a legislative body. So you have technocrats who are appointed to give representation for perspectives that are underappreciated. For example, you have senators in the Senate that that could present perspectives that don't have critical mass but still important. For example, when it comes to OKU or disabled people. So you may have disabled rights activists who are able to climb up the ranks eventually, and they are able to push forward whatever they need and so on. Okay, so yeah, so that's basically what we have for today. Let's take a look at some of the debate motions that we could derive from this. Yeah, this House prefers ranked choice voting over first past the post. This House believes that apex court cases with large cultural impacts must be subjected to a referendum. This House would allow a percentage of seats in the legislature via sortition, so on and so on. You could go through the one for this. I think the one that I would be interested to see in the future, probably we're not going to do today, would be this House supports the creation of joke or frivolous political parties. This is important and a proper debate because there are situations where people started parties as jokes and they eventually get into power. I think a great example of this, what happened in Italy at one point. Somebody started like a beer drinking party, and then they got voted into power, and then that translated into a serious political party. And now I think they're one of the more serious oppositions in Italy. It's wild. Politics is wild. Okay, all right. So we'll take a short break before the debate.